She thought she was putting Elon Musk in his place by mocking his necklace, until the real story behind it taught her a lesson she'd never forget. The hum of conversation in the first-class cabin was low, a mix of weary business travelers and quiet luxury. The late 11:45 p.m. flight from Los Angeles to Seattle was short, but long enough for passengers to settle into their routines, adjusting seats, flipping through in-flight menus, and exchanging polite nods. No one expected anything unusual until Elon Musk stepped in. There was no entourage or grand entrance, just a tall, slightly disheveled man in a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, carrying a small bag over his shoulder. At first glance, he looked like any other exhausted traveler. Some passengers did. Double takes as recognition dawned while others whispered among themselves, unsure if it was really him. Elon, unfazed, made his way to seat 2A, a window seat, sat down, adjusted his seatbelt, and pulled out his phone, wearing a neutral, detached expression, one of a man used to being stared at but indifferent to it. A flight attendant, a woman, in her late 30s with a sharp bob and a crisp uniform, noticed him too. Unlike the others, her eyes held no awe or curiosity. There was something colder, less friendly. She walked past him without a word, her polished heels clicking against the floor. But just as she reached the front of the cabin, she turned back. She paused at the front of the cabin, her eyes darting back toward his neck. Something had caught her attention. Around Musk's neck hung a small, simple pendant on a thin chain. It was unremarkable at first glance, just a metallic charm, slightly aged, resting against his collarbone, but something about it seemed to bother her. She turned to her colleague, a younger attendant standing by the galley, and murmured just loud enough to be heard, "Seriously? That thing looks like something you'd get out of a vending machine." A few passengers glanced up, some pretending not to hear, others exchanging awkward looks. The younger attendant shot her a hesitant glance, unsure how to respond. Elon didn't react. If he heard it, he gave no indication. He simply leaned back in his seat, scrolling through his phone, his face neutral. But the woman wasn't finished. She took a slow step forward, her expression shifting into something between amusement and condescension. She wanted a reaction. "Didn't expect someone like you to wear something so cheap," she muttered, her tone sharp. This time a few people definitely heard. A man in the row across furrowed his brow, while a woman near the aisle shifted, uncomfortably. Still, Elon didn't flinch. He didn't look up or acknowledge her at all. And that silence, it made things worse. The flight attendant lingered, waiting for him to respond. Maybe he'd laugh it off, maybe fire back a snide remark. But he did neither. He just kept scrolling on his phone as if she hadn't said a word. The silence unsettled her. She let out a small scoff and turned away, her heels clicking toward the galley. Passengers exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, unsure if they had just witnessed a passing joke or something mean-spirited. Others didn't care. First class was full of people too accustomed to privilege to be surprised by anything. The young attendant by the galley looked uneasy. She was new, probably on her second or third month, and had seen her senior colleague throw jabs before, but this time, it felt different. Seat 3B, directly behind Elon, belonged to a man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp suit, with salt and pepper hair and a presence that suggested he'd spent years in rooms where words mattered. He had seen enough power plays in boardrooms to recognize one in midair. Leaning slightly forward, the man in 3B spoke just loud enough for the flight attendant to hear as she passed by again. "You know who that is, right?" She barely glanced. At him. "Of course I know." "Everyone knows." He gave a slight nod, his tone casual but edged with warning. "Then you also know he could probably buy this airline before we land." The remark hung in the air, subtle but sharp, a gentle nudge for her to reconsider her actions. The flight attendant smirked but didn't respond, instead busying herself with the overhead bins, pretending the moment hadn't happened. Meanwhile, Elon finally put his phone down and pulled a small notebook from his bag. An actual notebook. Not a tablet or high-tech gadget, but a plain, leather-bound book filled with handwritten notes. The older businessman in 3B noticed and chuckled. "Didn't take you for a guy who still uses paper." Elon glanced at him, then at the notebook. "Not everything needs a battery," he replied simply, flipping a page. The businessman nodded, clearly impressed. "Fair enough." But across the aisle, the flight attendant wasn't done. There was something irritated in the way she kept glancing at Elon between tasks, her focus still on that pendant. She whispered something to another crew member, a male flight attendant, who seemed uninterested, barely looking up from his pre-flight checklist before mumbling, "Mm-hmm." But she wasn't letting it go. As she passed by Elon's seat again, slower this time, she spoke just loud enough for others to hear. "I don't get it. A billionaire wearing something that looks like it came from a gas station gift shop." This time, Elon reacted. He smiled, a small, knowing smile, not the kind that said, "You got me," but something else, something deliberate. And that's when a voice from the front of the cabin spoke up. Someone had recognized the necklace, and what happened next would make her regret ever opening her mouth. The tension in first class had thickened into something heavy and unspoken. The flight attendant still wore an air of smugness, convinced. She had made her point, but the moment Elon smiled, a crack appeared in her confidence. Then a voice from seat 1C near the bulkhead broke the silence. "That's not just any necklace," said an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, dressed in a dark blue blazer with silver buttons. She had a presence that commanded respect without trying. Turning slightly in her seat, she looked toward Musk before shifting her gaze to the flight attendant. "I've seen one just like it before. Years ago." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, but the woman continued, ignoring the skepticism. "That pendant is handcrafted, a very specific design. You won't find that in stores. It's not some random trinket." She paused before adding, "And it's definitely not cheap." A few passengers leaned in, intrigued, though the flight hadn't even taken off yet. Elon remained silent, letting the moment hang in the air, showing no urgency to defend himself. The flight attendant let out a forced laugh. "All right," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "So what? It's some kind of collector's item?" That's when seat 3B, the businessman, spoke again, his voice lower and more serious. "No, it's personal." Eyes flickered back to Elon, but still, he said nothing. The flight attendant hesitated, feeling her control slipping but unwilling to back down. "All right then," she pressed. "What's the big deal? Why wear something like that when you could have anything?" Elon finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Because I don't wear things for other people," he said, turning his head to meet her gaze directly. "I wear things that matter to me." The simplicity and finality of his words made the flight attendant falter. Before she could respond, the older woman in Seat 1C took a deep breath and spoke again. "That pendant. It was made by an artist. In South Africa, wasn't it?" Elon's expression stayed neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. The woman gave a small nod, almost to herself. "I thought so." The businessman in 3B sat back in his seat, exhaling slowly as if the pieces had just fallen into place. The flight attendant, however, was beginning to realize her mistake, but it was too late. The truth about that necklace was about to change. Everything. Her smirk had vanished, her confidence starting to crack. She had assumed the pendant was just a meaningless trinket, something Musk had thrown on without a second thought, but now the entire cabin was paying attention. Elon shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers grazing the pendant for the first time since she had mocked it. The way he held it, not in defense or anger, but with quiet reverence, made the whole cabin feel smaller, more intimate. The older woman in seat 1C tilted her head. "I met the man who made that once," she said softly. "Years ago, in Pretoria." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Pretoria, South Africa, Elon's home country. The flight attendant stiffened, realizing she had been so focused on making a joke that she hadn't stopped to consider what the necklace might actually mean. The businessman in 3B let out a breath. "It's handcrafted, isn't it? One of a kind?" Elon finally spoke, his voice softer now. "It was a gift," he said simply. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of passengers settling in had stopped. The air felt heavier, not tense, but filled with meaning. The woman in Seat 1C nodded slowly. "From your father?" she asked. Elon shook his head. "No." His fingers brushed the small charm again. "From a man who worked in my childhood home." The flight attendant blinked, thrown off as passengers exchanged glances. Elon took a slow breath and continued, his voice even. "His name was Temba. He was a carpenter, made beautiful things with his hands, though he didn't own much. He worked for my family for years, fixing furniture, carving wood. He used to tell me that every piece of wood has a story. You just have to know how to find it." His thumb pressed gently against the pendant. "One day, before I left for university, he gave me this. Told me he had carved it from the wood of an old chair he'd once repaired in our house. Said it was a reminder to never forget where I came from." The silence that followed was different now, not awkward or uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. The flight attendant swallowed hard, her arms, once confidently crossed, now hanging loosely at her sides. She opened her mouth to say something. Maybe to brush it off. Maybe to apologize, but nothing came out. What could she say? The businessman in 3B nodded slowly, almost to himself. "People always assume value is about price," he murmured. Elon gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the mistake they make." The flight attendant exhaled sharply, realizing she had made a fool of herself, and worse, in front of the wrong person. But Elon Musk wasn't finished yet. His words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her in a way she hadn't expected. Minutes ago, she had been smug, certain she'd made a witty remark at a billionaire's expense. Now she felt small. Yet Elon didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or revel in her discomfort. He didn't need to. The silence, the stares from other passengers, the shift in the cabin's energy, it was enough. She cleared her throat, trying to regain some composure. "I didn't mean," she started, but Elon's voice cut through her hesitation. "You did." It wasn't harsh. It wasn't even unkind. It was just the truth. The older woman in Seat 1C folded her hands in her lap, watching carefully. The businessman in 3B sat back, crossing one leg over the other, waiting to see how it would unfold. Elon turned slightly in his seat, finally giving the flight attendant his full attention. "You saw something you didn't understand," he said, his tone steady. "And instead of asking, instead of being curious, you judged it." The flight attendant's jaw tightened. She didn't like being called out, especially not in front of this crowd, but Elon wasn't done. "It's funny," he continued. "People assume money changes everything, that once you have enough, nothing else matters. But that's not how it works." He glanced down at the pendant, turning it gently between his fingers. This is worth more to me than any watch, any car, any company I've built. Not because of what it's made of, but because of who made it. Because of the meaning behind it." The businessman in 3B gave a knowing nod. "Wealth doesn't change. What matters?" he murmured. "It just makes people forget that some things can't be bought." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Even those who had been silent were now fully invested. But the flight attendant. This wasn't a billionaire flexing his wealth. This was a man reminding her, reminding everyone, that some things carry more value than a price tag. Her face flushed slightly, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I misjudged," she admitted finally, her voice quieter now. Elon didn't nod or accept it right away. Instead, he let the moment hang for just a second longer before finally speaking. Most people do. And with that, he leaned back in his seat. The conversation over. The flight attendant lingered for half a second as if she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the galley, this time without the smug confidence she had started with. Meanwhile, the plane doors closed, and as the flight prepared for takeoff, the energy in the cabin had completely shifted. Tonight, no one would forget what had just happened. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants made their final checks. The engines rumbled beneath them, a low vibration signaling that takeoff was near. But in first class, no one was thinking about the flight anymore. They were still sitting with what had just unfolded. The older woman in seat 1C glanced at Elon once more, a knowing look in her eyes. She had lived long enough to see how people treat those they think are beneath them, and she had seen what happens when they realize too late that they were wrong. The businessman in 3B let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. He wasn't laughing at the flight attendant. No, he was laughing at the situation, at how predictable it all was. "People judge so quickly," he muttered, not to anyone in particular. Elon didn't respond. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, in the galley, the flight attendant stood still, gripping the edge of the counter. Her stomach twisted in a way she hadn't expected. She had thought she was being clever, thought she was making a harmless comment. But now, in the quiet of her own mind, she felt it. The sting of realizing she had been the fool. And the worst part? It wasn't because he was Elon Musk. It wasn't because she hadn't just insulted a billionaire. That wasn't what stung the most. It was the realization that she had reduced something deeply meaningful to nothing more than a price tag, a lesson she should have already known. She let out a slow breath, trying to shake it off, but the weight of it lingered. Back in the cabin, the seatbelt sign dinged on and the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing final preparations for takeoff. Elon glanced out the window, the pendant resting gently against his chest, but his mind wasn't on the flight. He was thinking about Themba, the old carpenter with rough hands and a kind heart, the man who had once told him, "People don't always see value the way they should. One day, they will." That's what Themba had said when he gave Elon the pendant, and tonight, that day had finally come. The wheels lifted off the ground, the plane soaring into the night sky. No more. Words were spoken, but the message was clear. Some lessons come with a price. Others come with silence. But the ones that stay with you forever, those are the ones you never forget. Because some things in life are priceless. Not because of what they cost, but because of what they mean. How often do we judge something before we truly understand its value? If this story made you think, made you reflect, or even just made you pause for a moment, consider sharing it. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones we're told, they're the ones we live. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what really matters.